Somewhere between a coffee farmer in Colombia selling beans to a buyer in Japan, an oil tanker changing hands between Saudi Arabia and South Korea, and a small business in Nigeria importing machinery from Germany, there is a currency that almost none of these countries actually use day to day. And yet it shows up in nearly every one of these transactions anyway, not because anyone forces it to. Because quietly, the entire architecture of global trade and finance was built around it, and unwinding that architecture has proven far harder than anyone predicted. That currency is the US dollar, and the scale of its dominance is almost difficult to comprehend. Roughly 90% of all foreign exchange transactions in the world involve the dollar on one side. Around 60% of global foreign currency reserves held by central banks are denominated in dollars. Oil, the commodity that quite literally fuels the global economy, has been priced predominantly in dollars for decades. The United States accounts for roughly a quarter of global economic output, yet the dollar's footprint in global finance is closer to half. That gap between America's actual share of the world economy and the dollar's share of world finance is not an accident. It is the result of decisions made 80 years ago that nobody has managed to fully reverse since. So here is the mystery worth understanding. Why does a currency issued by one country end up as the default unit of account for the entire planet? Why do countries with no direct relationship to the United States still conduct trade with each other in dollars? And what happens to the rest of the world now that some of America's rivals are actively trying to build alternatives to a system that has quietly benefited the United States for generations? To understand this, you have to go back to July 1944 to a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where representatives from 44 allied nations gathered to design the post-war international monetary system. World War II had devastated the economies of Europe and much of Asia. The United States, by contrast, emerged from the war holding roughly two-thirds of the world's gold reserves and the only major industrial base left standing largely intact. Given that overwhelming economic position, the negotiators at Bretton Woods agreed to a system where the US dollar would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate, $35 per ounce, and every other major currency would be pegged to the dollar. In effect, the dollar became the world's reserve currency by design, not by accident, because the United States was simply the only country capable of backing a global monetary system at that moment in history. For roughly 3 decades, this arrangement worked reasonably well. Then, in 1971, President Richard Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold, an event now known as the Nixon shock, largely because the United States no longer held enough gold to back all the dollars circulating internationally, partly due to the costs of the Vietnam War and expanding domestic spending. This should have been the moment the dollar's global dominance ended. Currencies backed by nothing but government promise, so-called fiat currencies, are inherently harder to trust than currencies backed by a physical asset like gold. And yet, remarkably, the dollar's dominance did not collapse. If anything, it eventually grew stronger. Understanding why requires looking at what happened next, a deal struck not in a conference room full of 44 nations, but quietly, bilaterally, with a single kingdom. In 1974, following the oil crisis triggered by an OPEC embargo, the United States negotiated an arrangement with Saudi Arabia. The details of the original deal remain only partially documented publicly, but the outcome is well established. Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exports exclusively in US dollars and to invest its oil revenue surpluses back into US Treasury securities in exchange for American military protection and political support. Because Saudi Arabia was the world's largest oil exporter and a founding member of OPEC, other oil-producing nations largely followed suit, pricing their own oil in dollars as well. This arrangement became known, somewhat informally, as the Petrodollar system. Why did this matter so much? Because oil is not just any commodity. Every country on Earth needs energy, and for most of the 20th and early 21st centuries, that meant needing oil. If oil is priced in dollars, then every country that wants to buy oil needs to first acquire dollars, regardless of whether they trade with the United States directly. A country in Southeast Asia buying oil from the Middle East needs dollars to complete that transaction, even though neither party is American. This created a structural, continuous global demand for dollars that had nothing to do with American exports or American economic policy. It was demand generated simply by the mechanics of how the oil trade was priced. This single design choice rippled outward into something much larger than oil. Once dollars became the default currency for energy transactions, they naturally became the default currency for a much wider range of international trade and finance. Central banks around the world began holding large dollar reserves, not primarily to trade with the United States, but because dollars were needed to participate in global energy and commodity markets. Companies invoicing international trade contracts defaulted to dollars because it was simply the currency everyone already had on hand and trusted. The dollar's role stopped being about America's direct economic relationships and became about the dollar functioning as the plumbing that connected everyone else's economic relationships together. This is where the story stops being simply about oil and starts revealing something deeper about how monetary systems actually achieve global dominance. A currency does not become the world's reserve currency merely because the issuing country is powerful. It becomes dominant because enough of the rest of the world's transactions get structurally routed through it that switching away becomes prohibitively expensive and complicated for everyone simultaneously. Economists sometimes call this a network effect. The dollar is useful to you specifically because it is already useful to everyone else, which makes it more useful to you, which makes it more useful to everyone else again. Breaking that cycle requires enormous coordinated effort because no single country benefits from switching first if nobody else switches with them. Consider what this network effect actually looks like in practice today. The SWIFT messaging system, which banks around the world use to communicate and settle international transactions, processes the overwhelming majority of its message volume in dollar-denominated transactions. When the United States wants to apply economic pressure on a country, one of its most powerful tools is restricting that country's access to the dollar-based financial system, sometimes by cutting banks off from SWIFT entirely. Iran, Russia, and North Korea have all experienced versions of this. The clearest recent example came in 2022 when several major Russian banks were disconnected from SWIFT following the invasion of Ukraine, alongside a freeze on a substantial portion of Russia's dollar-denominated foreign reserves held abroad. The effect was immediate and severe. Russian banks struggled to process international payments, the ruble briefly collapsed in value, and Russian companies found themselves scrambling for alternative ways to settle trade with remaining partners. What made this moment particularly notable to central bankers worldwide was not just the impact on Russia, but the precedent it set. If a country's dollar reserves, assets it assumed were safely its own, could be frozen unilaterally over a political dispute, then holding large dollar reserves suddenly looked less like a safe haven and more like a liability contingent on staying in Washington's good graces. Several countries, including China, reportedly accelerated gold purchases and reserve diversification efforts in the years that followed, a quiet but measurable hedge against the same tool potentially being used against them one day. The dollar is not just a currency in this context, it is a choke point, similar in structure to the shipping alliances or the rare earth-refining bottlenecks explored elsewhere in this channel. Except instead of controlling physical goods, it controls the financial plumbing that physical goods depend on to actually get paid for. Why can't countries simply build an alternative? This is where the difficulty becomes clear, and it echoes a pattern that shows up again and again in concentrated global systems. Building an alternative reserve currency requires more than just declaring a currency important. It requires deep, liquid financial markets that foreign governments and companies trust enough to park enormous sums of money in for decades at a time. It requires political stability, rule of law, and a track record of not seizing or freezing assets arbitrarily. The United States Treasury market, worth tens of trillions of dollars, remains the deepest, most liquid government bond market on the planet, precisely because so many other countries have already built their financial systems around trusting it. No other country currently offers a comparable combination of market depth, legal predictability, and existing global usage. China has made the most serious attempt to build an alternative, promoting the renminbi for international trade and creating its own cross-border payment system, sometimes described as an alternative to SWIFT. Progress has been real, but slow. The renminbi's share of global reserves and international payments remains in the low single digits, a fraction of the dollar's share, partly because China maintains capital controls that limit how freely money can move in and out of the country, which makes foreign governments and investors understandably cautious about holding large renminbi reserves. Russia, following sanctions imposed after its invasion of Ukraine, accelerated efforts to trade oil in currencies other than the dollar, including the renminbi and the ruble itself, demonstrating that de-dollarization is possible at the margins, but Russia's overall share of global trade is too small to meaningfully shift the system on its own. There is also a quieter, less discussed dimension to this story, sometimes called the Eurodollar system, which has nothing to do with the euro currency, despite the confusing name. Eurodollars are simply U.S. dollars held in bank accounts outside the United States, largely unregulated by American banking authorities, and the Eurodollar market has grown into one of the largest, least visible pools of money in the global financial system, estimated in the tens of trillions of dollars. This market emerged almost by accident during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union wanted to hold dollar reserves outside the reach of American regulators, and it has since become deeply embedded in how global banks fund themselves and settle international transactions. Most people have never heard of it, yet it is arguably as important to global dollar dominance as anything decided at Bretton Woods. A newer challenge to dollar dominance has emerged from an unexpected direction: digital currency. Central banks around the world, including China's, have been piloting central bank digital currencies, government-issued digital money that could theoretically settle cross-border transactions without ever touching the traditional dollar-based banking system or SWIFT at all. China's digital yuan project, still in relatively early stages of international use, is explicitly framed by some Chinese officials as a long-term tool for reducing dependence on dollar-denominated payment rails. Separately, a wave of interest in cryptocurrency and stablecoins, digital tokens designed to hold a stable value, has created new, less regulated channels for moving money across borders outside traditional banking oversight entirely. Ironically, the majority of stablecoins in circulation today are themselves pegged to the U.S. dollar, meaning even this supposedly alternative technology has so far mostly reinforced dollar dominance rather than undermined it, extending the dollar's reach into digital and decentralized finance rather than displacing it. Still, central bank digital currencies represent a genuine long-term wildcard. If enough countries eventually build interoperable digital payment systems that can settle trade directly between each other's currencies, bypassing dollar conversion and SWIFT messaging entirely, the structural demand for dollars that has underpinned the system since the 1970s could begin eroding in ways that are difficult to fully predict today. Most economists remain skeptical this happens quickly, given how deeply embedded dollar-based infrastructure already is across global banking. But the technology is genuinely new enough that nobody can rule out a faster shift than history would otherwise suggest. So who benefits from this arrangement, and who bears the cost? The United States benefits enormously from what economists sometimes call exorbitant privilege, a term coined decades ago by a French finance minister who was somewhat irritated by the advantage. Because the world needs dollars, the United States can borrow money more cheaply than almost any other country, since global demand for dollar-denominated assets, like U.S. Treasury bonds, keeps interest rates lower than they would otherwise be. The United States can also run persistent trade deficits without facing the currency crises that would cripple most other nations attempting the same thing. because the rest of the world keeps demanding dollars regardless of America's trade balance. But that privilege carries costs that are increasingly visible on the other side of the ledger. Countries dependent on the dollar system are exposed to American monetary policy decisions made entirely in Washington without their input, yet with direct consequences for their own economies. When the U.S. Federal Reserve raises interest rates to fight domestic inflation, it can trigger capital flight and currency crises in developing countries whose debts are denominated in dollars, regardless of what is happening in those countries' own economies. And the ability to weaponize dollar access for geopolitical purposes, however justified in specific cases, has increasingly pushed rival nations to actively seek alternatives, creating exactly the kind of long-term erosion pressure that decades of dollar dominance were never designed to withstand gracefully. This is the same efficiency versus resilience trade-off that echoes through every hidden system this channel has examined. For 80 years, the world optimized around a single, deeply liquid, broadly trusted currency because coordinating around one dominant system was simpler and cheaper than maintaining multiple competing ones. It worked beautifully as long as the country issuing that currency behaved as a reasonably predictable, rules-based steward of the system. Now, as geopolitical tensions rise and the temptation to weaponize financial access grows, the rest of the world is beginning the slow, expensive process of building redundancy into a system that spent 8 decades becoming almost entirely centralized around one currency. Which brings you back to that coffee farmer in Colombia, that oil tanker crossing between Saudi Arabia and South Korea, and that small business in Nigeria importing German machinery. None of these transactions strictly need the U.S. dollar, and yet, quietly, almost invisibly, they still run through it, because 80 years of accumulated trust, liquidity, and habit are extraordinarily difficult to replace, even when the rest of the world increasingly has reasons to want to. The dollar was never chosen because it was the only possible option. It became unavoidable because enough of the world built its financial plumbing around it before anyone had a serious reason to build something else.